The security guard's eyes narrowed as he stepped in front of the entrance, blocking the woman from walking inside. His stance was firm, his voice commanding. "Ma'am, I need to see some identification," he said, his tone sharp. The black woman in front of him didn't flinch. She stood tall, her posture composed, her expression unreadable. There was no hesitation as she calmly reached into her bag. The guard smirked slightly. He had seen this before, people trying to walk into places where they didn't belong. He was sure she was just another outsider, another nobody. But the moment he looked at the ID in his hand, his face turned ghostly pale. His grip weakened, his breath hitched, and his knees nearly buckled beneath him. Because the woman he had just stopped, she wasn't just anyone. She was the last person he should have messed with. Have you ever seen someone completely underestimate the wrong person? Share your story in the comments. Stay until the end, because one moment will change everything. The morning rush was in full swing as people poured into the towering glass building, a prestigious corporate headquarters in the heart of the city. Employees in crisp suits hurried past the security desk, their ID badges clipped to their clothing, flashing them briefly before heading inside. At the entrance stood Mark Reynolds, a security guard in his late 40s. He adjusted his belt, scanning the crowd with a careful, practiced eye. His job was simple: keep out the wrong people. Mark had been working security for years. He had developed an instinct for spotting who belonged and who didn't, and from the moment he saw her approaching, something in him told him she didn't belong. She walked with quiet confidence, her head held high. Her tailored navy blue blazer fitted perfectly over a sleek black dress. Everything about her radiated authority, but Mark didn't see that. He saw someone unfamiliar, someone who didn't have the look of the usual executives who walked through these doors every morning. His suspicion kicked in immediately. Mark squared his shoulders as she neared the entrance. His instincts told him to stop her. As she stepped toward the glass doors, he moved into her path, blocking her way. "Excuse me, ma'am," he said, holding up a hand. "I need to see some identification before you enter." For a moment, she simply looked at him. Her expression didn't change. Mark was used to people arguing, questioning him, getting defensive. But this woman, she just gave him a small, knowing smile. Slowly, she reached into her bag. Mark smirked slightly, arms crossed. He had seen this before. People trying to walk in without clearance, pretending like they belonged until they were caught. What he didn't know was that in just a few seconds, his world was about to flip upside down. Mark watched as the woman calmly reached into her bag, his smirk barely concealed. He had seen this before. Someone trying to slip into a place where they didn't belong, thinking they could outsmart security. Not today. She pulled out a sleek, leather ID holder and handed it to him without a word. Her confidence unsettled him, but he ignored the feeling. He glanced at the ID, expecting to see a visitor pass, a name he didn't recognize, something that justified stopping her. But the moment his eyes landed on the words in bold print, his stomach dropped. The ID wasn't a visitor pass. It wasn't a low-level employee badge. It read CEO, Executive Director, and just beneath it, her name. Mark's fingers trembled slightly as he read it again, his brain refusing to process the reality. This wasn't just another businesswoman. She was the owner of the company, the person who ran the entire building, the one who signed the paychecks, including his. A cold sweat broke out on the back of Mark's neck. He felt the shift in the air. The woman was still standing there, watching him, waiting. She hadn't raised her voice. She hadn't gotten defensive. She didn't need to, because now she was the one in control. Mark swallowed hard, forcing himself to speak. His His voice cracked slightly, and he cleared his throat. "I apologize for the confusion, ma'am." The words felt heavy, unnatural coming from him. He had spent years asserting his authority, making snap judgments, assuming he always knew who belonged and who didn't. But now he had made a mistake he couldn't take back. The woman didn't respond right away. She simply studied him, her sharp gaze unwavering. Finally, she spoke, her voice calm, measured, but carrying undeniable weight. "Are you sure you want to do this?" Mark's hands grew clammy. He felt the stares of nearby employees, some whispering, others pausing in their tracks to see what was happening. He knew this moment wasn't just a misunderstanding. It was a disaster. The CEO of the company had just been stopped at the entrance of her own building, questioned like she didn't belong. And people had noticed. Desperate to fix his mistake, Mark straightened up, trying to regain his composure. "I was just following protocol," he said quickly. "We have to be cautious about who enters the building, you understand?" A weak excuse. Even he didn't believe it, because he knew. He wouldn't have stopped her if she had looked different. And now, the weight of that realization sank in like a stone. The CEO took a slow step forward, closing the small space between them. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. "I hope next time you think before you judge." Mark barely had time to nod before she reached out, took her ID back, and walked past him without another word. For the first time in his career, he felt truly powerless, because this wasn't just another person. This was his boss, and he had just made the worst mistake of his life. Mark stood frozen, his breath shallow as he watched the CEO walk past him without another word. She didn't demand an apology. She didn't need to. Her silence was louder than anything he had ever heard. Around him, the reality of the situation was sinking in fast. Employees whispered as they passed, glancing at him with a mix of curiosity and disbelief. Some of them had seen what happened, and some had recorded it. A younger security guard, Jason, who had been standing nearby, shifted awkwardly. "Dude, that was the CEO." His voice was barely above a whisper. "You stopped the CEO." Mark didn't respond. He couldn't. His pulse thundered in his ears as the weight of the mistake pressed down on him. The CEO of the company. The woman who had more power than anyone else in the building. The woman who signed his paycheck. And he had stopped her like she was a nobody. He had assumed, without thinking. And now, there was no taking it back. Minutes later, his radio crackled. "Mark, report to the main office, now." It was his supervisor. Mark swallowed hard. They knew. The entire security team knew. And now, he would have to face the consequences. As he walked toward the security office, he could still hear the whispers behind him, the stares, the judgment, and the worst part. He knew he deserved every bit of it. The moment he stepped inside the office, his supervisor was already waiting. A laptop was open on the desk. A security camera feed paused on the exact moment he had stopped the CEO at the door. The screen showed his mistake in crystal clear detail. His supervisor let out a slow breath, shaking his head. "Mark, what were you thinking?" Mark's throat felt dry. He had no excuse. His boss continued, "She didn't need to fire you." "That moment alone ruined your reputation." Mark clenched his jaw, nodding stiffly, because deep down, he knew it was true. Hours later, as he sat in his small security booth, staring at the same entrance where it had all gone wrong, he replayed the moment in his head over and over. What if he had just let her through? What if he hadn't assumed? But there were no second chances. He had judged her without thinking, and now it was his turn to be judged. Mark sat in his small security booth, staring blankly at the entrance doors. The same doors where his mistake had played out in front of dozens of employees and possibly thousands of online viewers. The weight of it pressed on him like a boulder. His phone buzzed. A message from a coworker. "Dude, the video is everywhere." Mark grabbed his phone with shaky hands and opened his social media feed. There it was, the footage. A grainy clip captured by an employee standing near the entrance. The video title made his stomach churn. "Security guard tries to block CEO from entering her own building. Instant regret." It had already racked up thousands of views. Comments flooded in. "Imagine stopping the person who signs your paycheck. Wild." The confidence on this man, and the way he panicked after reading her ID. This is why bias training needs to be mandatory. Happens every day, just not always to the CEO. Mark's hands clenched into fists. His worst fear had come true. This wasn't just a bad day at work. This was a career-ending mistake. A knock at his booth's door snapped him out of his spiral. He turned to see his supervisor standing there, arms crossed, expression unreadable. "The CEO wants to see you. Now." Mark's stomach twisted into knots. He forced himself to stand, his legs stiff and heavy, knowing this could be the last walk he ever took through these hallways. Inside the executive office, everything was sleek, modern, and intimidating. And behind the massive glass desk sat the woman he had stopped earlier that morning. The CEO. Her posture was calm, composed, just like it had been at the entrance. She wasn't angry, and somehow that terrified Mark even more. She gestured for him to sit. He did, barely able to meet her gaze. The silence stretched between them until she finally spoke. "Do you know why you're here?" Mark nodded slowly. "Yes, ma'am." She exhaled, tapping her fingers against the desk. "Do you remember what I asked you earlier?" His mind replayed the moment in slow motion. "Are you sure you want to do this?" He swallowed hard. "Yes," she nodded. "And do you understand why that question mattered?" Mark hesitated. Then quietly, he admitted, "Because I judged you before I even knew who you were." For the first time, the CEO's expression shifted. A flicker of something. Understanding. Disappointment. "This isn't about me," she said finally. "It's about the fact that if I were anyone else, a lower-ranking employee, a visitor, a new hire, this would have ended very differently for them." Mark felt a lump in his throat. Because she was right. If she had been someone else, he wouldn't have realized his mistake. There wouldn't have been a viral video. There wouldn't have been consequences. The CEO leaned forward, her voice even. "Tell me, Mark, do you think this was the first time something like this has happened?" His gut twisted. "No, ma'am." She nodded. "And do you think it will be the last?" He didn't have an answer. Because deep down, he knew the truth. She studied him for a moment, then let out a slow sigh. "Here's what's going to happen," she said finally. "You're not being fired." Mark's head shot up, shocked. She continued, "But you will be required to go through intensive bias training, and after that, you will speak to the entire security team about this incident. No excuses, no justifications, just the truth." Mark's mouth felt dry. He had expected to be fired on the spot. Instead, he was being given a second chance, but one that came with responsibility. The CEO stood, signaling that the meeting was over. "One last thing," she said as Mark rose to leave. He turned back, waiting. Her gaze was firm. "Next time, when someone walks through that door, think before you judge." Mark nodded, and for the first time, he truly meant it. Mark walked out of the CEO's office feeling lighter, yet heavier at the same time. He wasn't fired, but he wasn't let off the hook either. He had been given a second chance. a chance to prove that he had learned from his mistake. But now, he had to do something much harder than just keeping his job. He had to own up to his actions in front of the entire security team. The next morning, Mark stood at the front of the security training room. Dozens of guards sat before him, some watching him with curiosity, others with skepticism. They had all heard what happened. Some of them had seen the video. Now, they were waiting for him to speak. Mark cleared his throat, gripping the edges of the podium. He could feel the weight of the moment, but he refused to run from it. "I messed up," he started, his voice steady, "and I want to talk about why." A few guards exchanged glances. Mark continued. "I judged someone before I even knew who they were. And I know for a fact I'm not the only one who's done that." Silence. No one challenged him, because deep down, they all knew it was true. Mark exhaled. "What I did was wrong. And the truth is, if she hadn't been the CEO, I probably never would have realized it." That admission was heavy, but it was necessary. That's why we need to do better. The room was still. No one laughed. No one dismissed his words. Because for the first time, Mark wasn't speaking as someone trying to defend himself. He was speaking as someone who had finally learned. Over the next few weeks, the company rolled out mandatory bias training for all security personnel. Procedures changed. The way they assessed people at the entrance changed. Because the CEO hadn't just given Mark a second chance. She had used his mistake to create real change. Mark never forgot that moment at the entrance. Every time someone walked through those doors, he reminded himself to think before assuming. It didn't matter how they dressed. It didn't matter if they looked the part. What mattered was respect. What mattered was treating everyone as if they belonged, because they did. One day, months later, he spotted her again. The CEO. She walked through the entrance, just like before. This time, Mark didn't hesitate. He gave her a respectful nod, and for the first time, she nodded back. A silent understanding passed between them. No words were needed, because the lesson had already been learned. Mark's mistake wasn't just an embarrassing moment. It was a wake-up call. He had learned the hard way that assumptions can be dangerous, that judging someone based on appearance alone is never the right choice. And the truth? This happens every single day. But not everyone gets the chance to realize their mistake before it's too late. The CEO didn't just teach him a lesson, she created real change. Because power isn't about controlling who gets through the door. It's about making sure everyone is treated with the respect they deserve. And sometimes, the strongest lessons come from the quietest actions. What do you think? Should Mark have been fired, or did the CEO make the right call? Let us know in the comments. If you believe in respect for everyone, no matter their job, race, or background, hit that like button and share this video. And don't forget to subscribe for more real-life lessons and powerful stories like this, because sometimes one moment changes everything. See you in the next video.